And here we are back with define scope. So define scope converts all those requirements into a detailed description and narrative. And so it has your typical inputs and it has tools and outputs. Your tools, key to them are data analysis. One form of data analysis is alternatives analysis. What other options do I have? Courses of action besides the one I'm taking. Now is the time to assess it. You also want to do product analysis, right? You want to break it down, do some value analysis or value engineering. How can I streamline it, improve it, tighten it up, make it better? And then, of course, your outputs are your actual project scope statement. It's a narrative of what you're going to do, and document updates. Now, here's what the scope statement looks like, right? It is a narrative, and you can update it in an iterative fashion. And what a scope statement is saying is, man, here's what we're going to do on this project in, 7, 10, 12 sentences. It identifies what is and is not in the project. So these are in red, these are some of the things I would have. I'd state my project justification. That ties it to my business need that we did before the project started in the business documents. My project scope, which is the work to deliver it. The product scope, which are the features and functions we want long term. The boundaries, including what is not in the project, as well as constraints and assumptions. I want a detailed description of the product and acceptance criteria. That makes a great scope statement. Now, if I'm talking agile, right, I'm going to talk things like time boxing and product analysis, right? So in time boxing, this is a short period of time that an activity gets worked on in agile. And if the work isn't done in that time period, you stop anyhow and move some of those stories over to the next iteration, which will also be time boxed. And you can even do product analysis in Agile. That's very important. Remember, in predictive project management, you have kind of this fixed scope, schedule, cost. But in Agile, in product analysis, you're really more focused on cost and scope, not so much on schedule. They're like at opposite ends of the spectrum. Now, back to predictive project management, the scope statement gets broken down, and the word we use is decompose. We decompose the scope statement to create this organizational chart looking thing in the middle of the slide. That's called a work breakdown structure. It breaks the work down or decomposes the scope statement into manageable packages. It's a good visual product. It offers us a hierarchy, right, which is easy to see deliverables develop. And so we get there by starting with the scope statement at the top and decomposing it along the way. Okay? It's generally a top-down effort, though it can be bottom-up also. Here's a good picture of a work breakdown structure. And I could have the scope name and the scope statement here. I would list my developmental life cycle here, possibly, and break it down into tasks, subtasks. The lowest level of any work breakdown structure is the work package. That's also a test question. The lowest level of the work breakdown structure is the work package. Now, just because I said it was hierarchical can also look like a spreadsheet. You see the numbers indented? That also creates a hierarchy. Normally, we see it looking like an organizational chart, but I just wanted you to be aware it can look different. It's still hierarchical. So here is another picture of the hierarchical work breakdown structure. So I start with my product name or scope statement up here. I break it down into the life cycles and then break it down into the work packages eventually. And this tool we use is called decomposition along the way, right? So a well-formed work breakdown structure supports that great scope statement because it doesn't add things to it, doesn't subtract, just fulfills it. So here's the actual process inputs, tools, and outputs. Typical inputs, read them, review them, get used to them. Your tools, the big one is decomposition. I'm breaking down, I'm decomposing that scope statement down to my work packages. My big output is my scope baseline. Remember, by definition, the scope baseline is the scope statement and the work breakdown structure and the work breakdown structure dictionary. Well, I got this scope statement in the last process called define scope, and I just did develop the WBS and the dictionary. So now that I've got all three, my output is my scope baseline. The approach is generally top down, as I mentioned. It can be bottom up, be aware of that, but it's generally top down. And when you see it on the exam, it will be. Now this slide is a one-slide summary of all things work breakdown structure. I just wanted to share with you. I start here on the right with that work breakdown structure and what it looks like hierarchically. Notice this section here talks about the three parts of the scope baseline, which is the scope statement, the WBS, and the WBS dictionary. That is now the foundation of your entire project. These on the right are the processes where they were developed in. And then I have some facts and figures about that on the left. You can read those in your own time. So now I have my scope baseline. There are only three baselines: scope, schedule, and cost. Collectively, we refer to them as the performance measurement baseline, but they can also be seen individually. And it's an item that must be adhered to in predictive project management. You cannot change these baselines without going through integrated change control. So after that, I have two control processes. Remember, planning had two outputs, the scope management plan and the requirements management plan. Well, scope also has two control processes. One is called the validate scope, which is about the customers looking over and inspecting the product and deciding that they accept it. And what we want is, we do this at the end of each phase and of course at the end of the project, where we want this formal acceptance of the deliverable. The customer signs off that they either agree or we would do a change request. Okay? Now, the validate scope process has your inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs, like all other processes. The inputs are fairly typical, except for validated deliverables. Those validated deliverables as an input to this process is what came from your own project quality control. Your quality control's already looked at it, already measured it, already tested it against the requirements and the quality standards and said, yep, ready to go. And you bring all that data and the deliverable with you. And that's now an input into getting the customer to accept it. One of the key things the customer is going to do is inspect it and do some decision making. And at the end, we hope we have an accepted deliverable by the customer. If not, they would do change requests, which we go back to these three terms: must be known. Preventive action is for perceived deviations. Corrective action, change request, would be for actual deviations, and it could be defect repair. Now, this is, so where does validate scope fall within these three processes? Control quality, validate scope, and close project or phase. I'll let you chew on that. We'll talk about it in class. And then control scope is the other control process. Here, this is your typical control scope where we monitor the status, measure the results, and we compare the plan versus the actual, and we take actual results, and we take action Okay, so this is the actual process with the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs. For my inputs, your project management plan and your project documents are always an input in a control process. And that's because it's about comparing my plan versus my actual results. So this is the first two big bullets are your plan, and these are your actual results, the work performance data. I'm not sure how that got stuck in there. Work performance data. Okay, so this is my plan versus my actual results. My tool I will use is data analysis. I'm going to look at the data. I'm going to look for variances. And if so, I'm a project manager in predictive waterfall project management for the exam. I will take action. Okay? And so then output in every control process is work performance information. So I've analyzed the very data that was given to me. I've analyzed it. So that's an output. If there was a need for a change, I would do a change request. If the change request was approved, I would update the project plan and, of course, the documents. Now, this slide, like every slide, is a one-slide summary of everything we've just talked about, and from your readings and etc. in these slides. Notice I list all the processes, so you get familiar with those up top, and I repeat them again here just as a demarcation, a breaking mark. And so what I have up here are what's going on in each process, and down here I have the major outputs. So for example, in plan scope management, I end up getting two management plans. One is the normal how I'm going to do something. That's a normal management plan. The other one is about clarifying the priorities and controlling the requirements. The priorities of the requirements. I've listed them now in a priority order. I'm going to use a business analyst, and that's why sometimes the requirements management plan is called a business analysis, right? And so I have my two major outputs, which are my scope management plan and my requirements management plan. Now, collect requirements was the next process. This is about me managing and meeting stakeholder needs. Remember, good requirements lead to good deliverables. So I'm going to use my business documents and my charter as inputs, which is kind of different. You don't see those much anymore, but scope is that important, right? I'm going to use a lot of tools, including prototypes, data representation, etc. And I'm going to use a lot of interpersonal and team skills to get this done. My outputs were my requirements documentation. Remember, those are quantifiable, testable, traceable items, and requirements traceability matrix, which I showed you along the way. When I define scope, I'm going to make sure that remember, good requirements lead to good deliverables. So I'm going to define the product scope, the project scope when I define my scope. I'm going to define the success criteria, what's not in the project, etc. I'm going to do some data analysis, like what other alternatives are there. And my outputs are my scope statement, my big output. I'm going to skip over the work breakdown structure just for time and ask you to note that there are two control processes. Validate scope is about focusing on the customer seeking formal acceptance of the deliverable, where control scope is your typical control process. I'm going to look at the plan versus the actual results. I am going to look for variances, and I'm going to take action like change requests if I'm not on target. Well, that wraps up scope management. It was that easy. You were great. I look forward to seeing you again.